magi quam videran stellam sequentes prediam.
I decided to dedicate today's show to, in a kind of backhanded way, the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan, but it's really going to be quite a roller coaster ride, because I'm going to start with the Exodus from Egypt and work my way up there. And also, really, the theme of the show is Jesus, I trust in you, is basically trust in God and obedience to God, and the relationship between the two as they were illustrated very, very graphically and very powerfully in the true story of the Exodus from Egypt. So it's going to seem like a jigsaw puzzle, but I hope all the pieces come together by the end. First of all, I just want to set a little bit of a backdrop. It is a very interesting and somewhat perhaps peculiar time we're living in the relationship between God and man and in the church, because we're really living in the age of Jesus, I trust in you. When you think of the revelations, self-revelations that God has made to man through the church in the last century or century and a half, it is very, very heavily oriented towards God wanting nothing more than us to have a childlike trust in him. You can see this pattern as beginning with Saint Therese of the Child Jesus. Her entire little way, her entire spirituality was oriented towards having total childlike confidence in God and in his promises and in his love, and just placing herself in God's hands in total abandonment as a small child would if that small child had the world's most loving, competent father who doted on her. So Saint Therese of the Child Jesus was very much about Jesus, I trust in you, and entirely being confident in God's providence and in his presence and his love. And then we have, of course, Saint Faustina and the revelation of divine mercy through her. And what was the logo or the motto that Jesus wanted painted at his feet in the divine mercy image? It was, Jesus, I trust in you. And this isn't a show about St. Faustina's diary, but I'll just read one paragraph, paragraph 1578. The Lord Jesus said to Sister Faustina, quote, "The graces from my mercy are drawn by one vessel, and that vessel is trustfulness. The more trustful a soul is, the more it will receive. Souls that have boundless trust are a great comfort to me, for into such souls I pour all the treasures of my graces. I am pleased when they ask for much, for I want to bestow much, even very much. But I am saddened when souls ask for little, when they tighten up and close up their hearts." So again, this whole theme that God wants nothing, that there's no greater worship for God to receive than that of total confidence and trust in him, which of course is very centered, or rather totally requires a trust in divine providence, because that is how God interacts with us. That's the normal way of God interacting with us is the events of our lives. Now, before I get into the Exodus from Egypt, which is what this show is going to center on, I'm just going to go to one other contemporary prophet of total trust in Jesus, and that is Father Dolindo. Some of you may be familiar with his Surrender Novena. Father Dolindo was an extremely saintly Italian priest who lived in the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, Padre Pio called him a saint. Padre Pio knew him. And when penitents would come to Padre Pio, to San Giovanni Rotondo, coming from Naples, Padre Pio would say to them, "Why do you come to me? You have a real saint in your city, in Naples, Father Dolindo." So I'm going to read an extract from a prayer of his, which purports to be Jesus talking to the soul. So Jesus to the soul: "Why are you upset and agitated? Leave your cares to me, and all will be fine. I tell you honestly, every act of true and blind reliance on me results in what you desire and will resolve all your difficulties. Abandonment in me does not mean being frustrated, becoming anxious and desperate, offering me your anxious prayer. So, abandonment means to shut the eyes of your soul in peace, moving your thoughts away from your troubles, and instead of thinking about your worries and pain, let me take over your troubles. Simply say, Jesus, you take over. To be worried, restless, and to think of the consequences of an event is the opposite of reliance. It is contrary to it. Shut your eyes and go with the flow of my grace. Do not ponder over your present moment and put away thoughts of your future as a temptation. Rest in me, believe in my goodness, and I swear on my love. How many things I can do, be it material or spiritual, when the soul turns to me, looks at me, and says to me, Jesus, you take over, and closes its eyes and rests in me. So this is all a backdrop. It's a backdrop for the story of the Exodus from Egypt. So we're going to jump back in time, about 4,000 years or so, to the time of the Jews' slavery in Egypt. I'm going to give a very compressed account of the Exodus from Egypt, and then I will explain how it is an extremely vibrant picture of exactly what God is longing for more than anything else, which is that we take him at his word, that we believe him, that we believe his promises, we believe his love, we believe his power, we believe in his overwhelming or overarching providence. And that the story of the Jews, 40 years of the desert in Egypt, 40 years in the desert in Egypt, is a perfect illustration of that problem of human nature of not trusting in God. So in order to put the story in context, I will extremely briefly give a little synopsis of the story of the Exodus from Egypt. First of all, let me just back up and say, before the coming of Christ, the relationship between God and the Jewish people was the relationship which God intended in the future for all mankind through Jesus and through the church. So you can see that the stories of the Jews in the Old Testament as a kind of picture in advance of the life of the church, of the relationship between God and man through Jesus and through the church, which was to come. And the story of the Jews was a kind of a precursor to its fulfillment through the church. So from the very earliest of the church fathers, the church always saw the story of the Exodus from Egypt, of the Jews' Exodus from Egypt, as a story of the coming of Christianity. The Jews' slavery to the Pharaoh in Egypt was a picture of humanity's slavery to Satan, to the power of Satan. The Pharaoh was a picture of Satan. The Jews were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, as mankind, without the salvation brought by Jesus, are and were slaves to the power of Satan. The Jews were freed from the power of the Pharaoh by crossing the Red Sea. You know the story. God raised up a deliverer, Moses, who is a picture of the true deliverer, Jesus. God raised up this preliminary deliverer, Moses, as a picture of Jesus, to free the Jews from slavery in Egypt. Moses confronted Pharaoh, Satan, and got Pharaoh to allow the Jews to leave, sort of subdued Pharaoh's power over the Jews. But then Pharaoh changed his mind, and after the Jews began to leave, Pharaoh sent the army after them, and God miraculously parted the waters of the Red Sea for the Jews to cross through, and then the waters flowed back and drowned the Egyptian army, and that affected the freedom of the Jews from the reach of Pharaoh, from the power of Pharaoh. The church fathers always saw that as a picture of the waters of baptism that free the Christian from the power of Satan. Then the Jews had to wander through the desert for 40 years on the way to the promised land. This is a picture of the Christian wandering through the desert of this life for 40 or 80 or 100 years on the way to the true promised land, the heavenly Jerusalem, not the earthly Jerusalem. The Jews were sustained in their journey through the desert by the miraculous bread from heaven, the manna, which was a picture, of course, of the Eucharist, the true miraculous bread from heaven that sustains the Christian in his or her journey through the desert of this life on the way to the promised land. And the Jews finally enter the promised land, of course, by crossing the Jordan River. And the spot where the Jews cross the Jordan River to enter the promised land happens, not coincidentally, but God incidentally, to be the exact same place where Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River. This is true. The Jews crossed over into the promised land at the same crossing point of the Jordan River where John the Baptist was busy baptizing and where Jesus went to be baptized by John the Baptist and where Jesus was baptized. And if you go on pilgrimage to Israel, you can visit that spot, the true spot, not a tourist spot somewhere else on the Jordan River that they built to be more convenient, but this one is actually right at where the Jordan River is about to flow into the Dead Sea. It's just outside of Jericho, actually a little bit south of Jerusalem. And if you go there, you can see that it is not only a shrine to Jesus' baptism in Jordan, but it's also a shrine to the crossing of the Jews into the Holy Land after their exodus from Egypt and after their wandering in the desert. So, as I go on with today's talk, I want you to keep in mind that the story of the exodus from Egypt isn't just a true history of what happened to the Jews, but it was designed by God to be a picture of basically the problems of the spiritual life for the entire life of the church. So, back to the exodus from Egypt now. So when the Jews first, let me see exactly where I'm going to start. Okay, so the Jews were released by the Pharaoh, and then the Pharaoh sent the army after them. The Red Sea parted. The Jews miraculously crossed the Red Sea. The Pharaoh's army was drowned, and Moses and the Jewish people immediately broke into a song of thanksgiving. It's known as Miriam's song. I'll just read a couple of passages. It's from Exodus 15. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name. Thy right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. In the greatness of thy majesty thou overthrows thy adversaries. Thou sends forth thy fury, it consumes them like stubble. Who is like thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like thee, majestic in holiness, terrible in glorious deeds, doing wonders? And so forth and so on. You couldn't imagine a more heartfelt, deep, joyful praise of God's power and of his protective love, right? Well, you'd think that might have lasted the Jews for the 40 years in the desert. I've got bad news for you. It didn't even last for 3 weeks in the desert. Then Moses led Israel onward towards the Red Sea on their crossing over to the Promised Land. And it went just 3 days in the wilderness. It didn't even last 3 days. The Jews' confidence, their trust in God, their confidence in God. Okay, 3 days earlier, they saw the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea. 3 days earlier, they were singing God's praises. 3 days later, they went in the wilderness and found no water. And what did they do then? They came to a spot they later called Marah, which means bitter. They could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, they named it Marah. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Why did you take us? There's no water. What shall we drink? Did you just bring us into the desert to die? Anyway, and then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord miraculously sweetened the water so they could drink it. And then the Jews set out again, further on their journey, and they came to the wilderness of Sin, and on the 15th day of the second month after they had left Egypt. So now we're a month and a half out of the parting of the Red Sea, right? Pretty big miracle. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness and said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, where we sat by the flesh pots and ate bread to fill our stomachs, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." So you see, they had no trust in God. They had just seen all these miracles. They had just been freed from 400 plus years in slavery. And 6 weeks later, God doesn't exist. God turned his back on them. God's going to let them starve to death and die of thirst. That's how they felt. And that is, if I can say so, how we are always feeling, how we go through this life, right? We go through this life and we have moments where we see God's presence very active in our lives, certainly moments where we feel his presence and his love. And it doesn't take anything. It doesn't take much more than a red light when we're in a hurry driving someplace to think that God doesn't exist and has abandoned us. Anyway, back to the Jews in the desert. Then the Lord said to Moses, when the Jews were complaining that they were going to starve to death, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day." And so Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, when the Lord gives you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your murmurings when you murmur against him." So then the Lord miraculously provided them with a flock of birds that crashed to the ground for them to eat meat that evening, and the manna in the wilderness every morning for the rest of their journey. Okay, you think that by now they would have confidence in God, right? Well, it didn't take very long. Again, we're just talking about, weeks. And then they set out from the desert of Sin, and they made camp at Rephidim, where there was no water. And again, the people complained about their thirst, that they were going to die of thirst. And Moses struck a rock. God told Moses, "Strike this rock with your staff, and water will come gushing out." So Moses struck the rock. The water didn't come out immediately. He struck the rock a second time, and the water gushed out. Water flowed from it. That place is called Meribah, because which means complaining, because the Jews again complained about the water. Now it's interesting that Moses struck that rock twice, because it turns out that, and I'm going to get there, I haven't gotten there yet, the only reason the Jews spent 40 years in the desert is because they didn't trust God. And the only reason why Moses, after the 40 years in the desert, wasn't allowed to enter the promised land with the rest of the Israelites who entered the promised land was because Moses didn't trust God and struck that rock a second time. Okay, so you can see that lack of trust in God is the cardinal sin in a way. Now, I'm going to back up both in my life and also in Judaism a little bit. The beginning of Judaism was Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, right? God told Abraham much earlier, "I'll make you the father of a great nation," but Abraham and his wife Sarah were childless. When Abraham was about 100 years old and Sarah was about 80, God miraculously gave them a child, Isaac, who was to be the son of promise. They weren't looking forward to any more children at that point. And as soon as Isaac became a young lad, God immediately told Abraham to sacrifice him to him. And Abraham took Isaac up on Mount Moriah and bound him to a pile of wood and was about to sacrifice him make a holocaust of him, when the angel intervened and told Adam not to slay his son. And in return, told Adam, "Because you have done this and have not withheld your only son, I will indeed make you the father of a great nation, and through your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed, which was the promises and the Messiah. Now, when I read that story as a child, as a Jewish child, of course, I thought that Abraham's great virtue was his obedience, that without a moment's hesitation, he was willing to sacrifice his son, who he greatly loved, who had waited all his life for, out of a willing obedience to whatever God wanted, was what he wanted. Well, that's true. It was one heck of an act of obedience. It might have been an act of trust, or it might not have been an act of trust. That's open to conjecture. There is a theological opinion within Judaism that Abraham was willing to do it because Abraham trusted God to restore Isaac to him. That's possible. It's not evident in the story. It certainly was an act of obedience, and I grew up thinking that it was this act of obedience which was the greatest possible worship that one can give God. Now, I doubt that. Now I think that total trust in God, which means trust in divine providence also, is the greatest act of worship one can give to God. And in fact, if you stop to think about it, you can't have obedience if you don't have trust. I mean, to have obedience, once you trust God, then you are free to obey him, because you know that everything that is going to happen is the best thing that can happen to you. To be willing to obey him without trusting that he is in control of things, that seems to be pretty thin ice. But anyway, I just want to throw that out there to ponder the relationship between Jesus, I trust in you, and obedience to God, and whether, in fact, Jesus, I trust in you, is what enables the saints to be totally obedient and always do God's will. It's certainly a lot easier to always be willing to do God's will if you always trust that God's will is what happens. I mean, that God gets his way. Anyway, back to the Jews in the desert. I just gave you the story of Marah, which is where the water was bitter and the Jews complained, we're going to die. You just brought us out here to dig our graves. And then at Meribah, where the Jews complained again, and where God performed those two miracles. Now, Catholics, there's a divine office. There's a daily prayer that many Catholics do, and all Catholic religious, whether priests or nuns or monks, are under pain of sin to do the divine office every day. And in the traditional divine office, there is one psalm. That's the first psalm of morning prayer. Okay, and it is Psalm, let me turn to it here. It is Psalm 95, and I'll read the psalm. It's a very short psalm that every Catholic religious says every morning. O come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God, the great King above all gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he made it. For his hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. Oh, that today you would hearken to his voice. Harden not your hearts as in Meribah, as on the day at Massa in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me and put me to the test, although they had seen all of my works. 40 years I loathed that generation, and said, they are a people who err in heart, and they do not know my ways. Therefore I swore in my anger that they should not enter into my rest. Okay? Stop and think about that. Every morning, Catholic religious say this psalm that is recounting the Jews doubting God in their exodus from Egypt. And in fact is explicitly saying, God is saying, That's why you had to wander 40 years in the desert, is because you did not trust me. So that is a pretty powerful message to us, that God wants our trust more than anything else. Now, I'll go on with the story of the Exodus from Egypt, because the entire story of the Exodus from Egypt is an illustration of the absolute centrality of trusting in God and trusting in his providence and in his protective love. So, we've only gotten 3 months in the desert so far, and it's 40 years, so I better speed up. I'll get to Mount Sinai, and then I'll take a short break and come back. So 3 months after the Jews left from Egypt, not very long, right? 3 months after leaving Egypt, they get to Mount Sinai, and God calls Moses to go up on the mountain. And Moses, of course, is going to go up on the mountain and receive the 10 Commandments. And so Moses is told to go up on the mountain, and he's going to stay on the top of the mountain for 40 days while he receives the Torah from God. And when the people saw that Moses did not immediately come down from the mountain, because he was up there for 40 days, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron, who was the priest, and said to him, "Come on, make us gods, who shall go before us, because this Moses, this man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him." 3 months after the parting of the Red Sea, and they doubt everything already, again, for like the 5th time. So the people took off their rings of gold, took off all their gold. They gave it to Aaron the priest, who melted it down and made the famous golden calf. And the people said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." The golden calf, right? So anyway, this was a huge disaster, needless to say. When Moses came down to the camp with the 10 Commandments, the 2 tablets of stone that God had written on, he smashed them. In fact, he destroyed the golden calf. And anyway, and then it ends up with Moses ascending Mount Sinai again to receive 2 new stone tablets. So again, it takes so little to lose our trust in God, and it leads us so far astray, and the results are so incredibly disastrous. I'm going to skip the terrible things that happened as a result of the golden calf incident, and I will move ahead to it's only to 2 years, so I'll move ahead about a year and a half, and we're now the Israelites have now come to the edge of the promised land. Okay, so after about 2 years in the desert, the Israelites reach a spot called Kadesh Barnea, an oasis in the desert that is just on the southern edge of the promised land. And I'll leave you on the edge of your seats to hear why they didn't enter the promised land after just 2 years crossing the desert, but instead had to spend 40 years going in circles in the desert before God allowed them to enter the promised land. And in fact, the reason why God kept them for those 40 years is because they had behaved so badly in not trusting his promises that God swore in his anger, as that psalm said, "They shall not enter into my rest." In other words, God wanted all of the Israelites who left Egypt to die of old age in the desert and only have their offspring enter the promised land, because all those people who were adults when they left Egypt were so unfaithful to believing in God's promises. And now we've come to the point about 2 years after they escaped Egypt, 2 years after all the miracles that Moses performed that got Pharaoh to let them go, turning the waters of Egypt into blood, and the plague of frogs and so forth and so on, and the slaying of the firstborn, and the crossing of the Red Sea, and the man in the wilderness, and all of those miracles. Now the Jews are at the edge of the promised land, about to enter, right? And finally come back home. Remember, that's where they started out. They're not colonizers. They were already there before they ended up in slavery in Egypt. But anyway, they're about to recover their homeland, to return to their homeland, and they reach this oasis in the desert on the southern edge. And before entering, Moses decides to spy out the territory to see what they have to be prepared for in the way of warfare with tribes. So he selects one spy out of each of the 12 tribes to scout out the land. And among those 12 were two who turned out to be good guys, Joshua and Caleb, and we'll hear about the others. So anyway, they all entered into the promised land. They all went in different places. They went all the way through from the very southern edge, you can think of it in terms of Beersheba, all the way up almost to Damascus, what's now the border between Israel and Syria, up there in the Golan Heights, to explore the entire land. And they came back after 40 days, and this was their report. They said they came back, and they said after 6 weeks they came back. That was 40 days. They said the fertile land does indeed flow with milk and honey, but the cities are well fortified, and the inhabitants are far too strong for us to take on. And only one of the spies, Caleb, tried to urge the Israelites to attack and claim the land. The men who had gone up with him said, quote, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great size. And there we saw the Nephilim, who were supposed to be the sons of, basically the Nephilim were supposed to be the descendants of how can I put it, improper relations between demons and human women, and the offspring were these very powerful giants. And the spies reported back that there they saw these Nephilim, and we seemed to be like grasshoppers next to them, and they looked to us, or rather they saw us as though we were grasshoppers next to them. And then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night, and all the people of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, "Oh, that if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness." So this is all of 2 years out, but they're tearing their hair out and despairing. This is Numbers 14 now that I'm reading from. And they said to one another, "Let us choose a captain and go back to Egypt." So now they're about to turn around and give up, right? Because they don't believe that God is going to be true to his promise. And then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces and prayed. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes and said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, "The land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are but bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." But all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the people of Israel, and the Lord said to Moses, "How long will this people despise me, and how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs which I have wrought among them?" And then the Lord got very angry and declared that, quote, "Not one of them will see the land I promised to their ancestors." And Moses is instructed by God to leave tomorrow and follow the road toward the Red Sea. And that was the condemning of the Israelites, their 40 years in the desert, because they didn't matter how many miracles they saw. It didn't matter how much they praised God in the middle of one of these miracles. "Oh, we'll never turn our backs on you. Oh, we know you're more powerful than ever and than any enemy." As soon as they were tempted with a little fright at this, at the power of the enemy, they gave up on God completely, as though God was not able to take care of the situation, even though he had led them that far and done all those miracles. Now, let me back up a little bit And I think the message here is very clear. But we have more miracles than those Israelites did in the desert, right? We have the Blessed Sacrament. And if one doubts the Blessed Sacrament, which I don't think is a very wise thing to do, but even if you doubted the miracle of the Blessed Sacrament, come on, we're Catholics. Take a look at all the miracles that God has given us. Look at the miracle of the sun in Fatima. Look at the medical miracles at Lourdes. Look at the Eucharistic miracles where the Blessed Sacrament, how can I put this properly? The appearance of a Blessed Sacrament reverts, so to speak, to its the true substance of human flesh and human blood. In other words, the appearance becomes what our faith teaches us it is. And even in our day, in 1996, in 1999, in 2007, there were Eucharistic miracles where consecrated hosts, in the context of a Mass, became human blood and human muscle tissue. And in all three of those cases, Buenos Aires 96, Buenos Aires 99, and Poland in 2007, the hosts that had became flesh and blood were examined by forensic scientists without being told where they came from. And in all three cases, they were totally proven to be human muscle tissue from a male who died in great agony and human blood, heart muscle tissue. So we have all these miracles. I could go on and on and on and on. And yet we allow ourselves to be tempted by doubt. And this, now I'm going to get into the spiritual warfare part of this talk, I guess, which is that is the nature of spiritual warfare for most of us throughout this life. Is we're not going to be assailed by the Satan setting our bed on fire like he did the Cure of Ars, or pulling us out of bed and smashing us against the floor like he did to Padre Pio. We are going to be assailed by Satan between our ears, inside our heads. And all that Satan has to do and really wants to do is get us to lose our faith and lose our confidence in God and think that whatever the problem is, God can't handle it. Hence, we have Dolindo. Hence, we have Saint Therese of Lisieux. Hence, we have Saint Faustina. All Jesus wants is for us to have total confidence that he can handle it and he will handle it. And all that Satan really wants is for us to decide that Jesus can't handle it or won't handle it, and we have to worry about it ourselves. So that is the core of most of our spiritual warfare. Now I'm going to quickly get back. How much time do I have? I have about 10 minutes. Get back, and I hope I get the Jews into the promised land before the end of the hour. So they spend 40 years wandering in the desert, and then 40 years after they leave Egypt, they return to the edge, or they reach the edge of the promised land. Now it's a little bit further north than they were before. Now it is the mouth of the Jordan River, where it's about to flow into the Dead Sea. Now they are actually at the spot in the Jordan River where Jesus ended up being baptized. And they are there, and their leader is now Joshua, who was one of the spies who said, no, we should invade Canaan because the Lord said he will make us victorious and will eat the enemy like bread, but no one would listen to him. But now he's leading them. Moses has died. He died within sight of the promised land on the top of Mount Nebo, but God wouldn't let him in because he didn't have faith. He didn't have confidence in God when God said, strike the rock with your staff and water will come out. So he hit it a second time. And that was enough that he didn't merit entering the Holy Land. But Joshua is there at the edge of the Jordan River, and they have the Ark of the Covenant with them. And he tells the priests to lead the troop and to step foot in the Jordan River. And as soon as the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant step foot in the Jordan River, the water stops flowing just like the Red Sea, and the waters pile up to the north, and the entire nation of Israelites, of Israel, cross over dry shod. There were about 2 million of them, by the way. It must have taken quite a while. And then when all of them have crossed over, the priests with the Ark of the Covenant cross over, and the waters flow again. So you see that God, when the Jews trusted the Lord, he repeated the miracle of the Red Sea. All it took was carrying the ark, by the priests, and then touching with their feet the waters of the Jordan River, and the water stopped flowing. So when they had confidence, when Joshua had confidence that the Lord was going to take care of everything, he did entirely sovereignly with yet another great miracle. And then they enter the promised land, and about 5 miles in, they come to a fortified city, very strongly fortified city, very ancient city, one of the oldest cities on earth. I think it was founded about 10,000 years BC, and that's Jericho. And Jericho had the wall around it. So did Joshua and the Israelites despair and take out their pickaxes and try to pick their way through the wall? No. All they did was circle the wall, praying, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, leading the procession, and the priests blowing the shofar, the ceremonial horn used in Jewish prayer. It's a ram's horn. And as they circled the walls of Jericho, as you know the story, the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, and the Jews entered the promised land victorious in this beautiful reversal of their first failed attempt, because their first failed attempt only failed for one reason, which is they didn't trust God's promises. And the second attempt, they relied entirely on God's promises, not on their own strength in the least. And the waters parted like the waters of the Red Sea, and the walls came tumbling down. And you couldn't have a more dramatic illustration of that all it takes is, like Father Dolindo says in his Surrender Novena, like St. Faustina, or Jesus said to St. Faustina. Let me read that quote again, if I can turn back to it. The graces from my mercy are drawn by one vessel, and that vessel is trustfulness. The more trustful a soul is, the more it will receive. So anyway, beautiful, vibrant story about that. Now, in the couple of minutes that close, I'm going to get back to the spiritual warfare aspect, because we've gotten to the city of Jericho. The walls came tumbling down because of the faith, the trust in God's promises that at that point the Israelites had. And if you go to Jericho, if you look up, you will see the Mount of Temptation. It is immediately behind the old city of Jericho. As a matter of fact, it's only about a mile, and most of that mile is going up the mountain. In other words, it's about a half a mile from the old city of Jericho, and about a half a mile up the mountain, you can see the Mount of Temptation, and you can actually visit the cave where Jesus spent those 40 days. And what was he doing for those 40 days? He was dealing with the devil's temptation, right? The devil gave him the 3 temptations, and he successfully resisted those 3 temptations, and the devil fled at the end of those 40 days, and Jesus began his public ministry. So, and the normal Catholic understanding is that the power that we have over Satan and over temptation come from 2 sources. It comes from our baptism and the defeat of the power of Satan through our baptism, which happened at this very spot, right? Because Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River at this very spot. And it was Jesus's baptism that gave the waters of baptism the power to defeat Satan. It was the inauguration of baptism at this very spot. So that's one of the sources of our power to defeat temptation and thereby to defeat Satan. And the other source of our power is by Jesus's successful resistance of the temptations. He gave mankind the ability to follow in his path, in his footsteps. in resisting the temptations. And all of this took place at the very same spot on the earth. The spot where Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, which is the spot where the Jewish people were able to first enter the promised land in this miraculous way, which is the spot where Jericho was, where the walls of Jericho came tumbling down in the face of the Lord's presence among his people, and where Jesus faced and overcame all of the temptations of Satan, all in one place. So you can think of this spot on the earth as the ultimate kind of wormhole between spiritual warfare and the physical world. It's where the two met in a way like unprecedented and unequaled in the rest of salvation history. And so with that, I've come to the end of the hour of our time together. You've been listening to Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism on Radio Maria with me, your host, Roy Schoeman. And I hope that you have enjoyed this journey through about 4,000 years of history and up until the coming of Christ and the next, whatever period it is between the coming of Christ and the second coming, when we will be reaping the fruits of his victory.
And